February 3, 1945. Camp Amori, Tokyo Bay, Japan. The tin can sat between them like a fragile truce. Corporal Jack Harrison of the 19th Bombardment Group stared at it. Then at the man across from him, a Japanese guard named Tanaka Hiroshi, no older than 23. The can contained sardines, half a day's ration, maybe less. Outside, the wind howled off Tokyo Bay, carrying the scent of salt water and ash from the recent firebombing. Harrison's stomach cramped with hunger, so sharp it felt like a blade twisting beneath his ribs. Tanaka's hands trembled as he held the can opener, his face hollow, eyes sunken deep into their sockets. If you're moved by stories like this, stories of humanity, breaking through the machinery of war, smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. We're here to uncover the moments history forgot, the connections that defied the impossible. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, whether it's California or Cairo. Your support keeps these untold stories alive. Harrison had been taught to hate this man. 4 months in Amori had reinforced that lesson with beatings, starvation, and the casual cruelty of captors who viewed prisoners as less than human. But now, watching Tanaka's trembling hands, Harrison understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. They were both starving, both abandoned, both forgotten by the war machines that had thrown them together. And in that moment when Tanaka split the ration in half and handed one portion to his enemy, Harrison realized the war had already ended not on battlefields or in surrendered documents, but here, in the space between two hungry men sharing their last meal. Everything he thought he knew about the enemy died with that gesture. To understand how two men on opposite sides of the Pacific War came to share a tin of sardines, you must first understand the hell that forged them. By February 1945, the Japanese Empire was dying. American B-29 superfortresses had begun their systematic destruction of Japanese cities. Tokyo had burned in the Great Raid of February 23rd, killing over 100,000 civilians in a single night. Japan's shipping lanes were severed. Its oil reserves had dwindled to almost nothing. For every barrel of oil Japan scraped together, the United States produced 300. The collapse was visible everywhere, even in the prison camps. Camp Amori sat on a man-made island in Tokyo Bay, a facility designed to hold 500 prisoners. By early 1945, it housed over 800. American, British, Australian, and Dutch posts crowded into wooden barracks that leaked freezing seawater during high tide. Rations had been cut to 600 calories per day, less than a third of what a man needed to survive. Dysentery, beriberi, and pneumonia moved through the camp like silent executioners. Men died in their sleep, and their bodies were left on the parade ground until morning roll call. Jack Harrison had arrived at Amori in October 1944 after his B-29 was shot down over Osaka. He'd been part of the 19th Bombardment Group, flying out of Guam. His crew of 11 had been reduced to 4 survivors by the time they hit the ground. The Japanese military police had beaten them during interrogation, then shipped them to Tokyo. Harrison was 26 years old, a farm boy from Nebraska who'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor. He'd expected glory. He found only hunger, cold, and the slow erosion of hope. But the Japanese guards were suffering too. Tanaka Hiroshi had been conscripted in 1943, pulled from his family's farm in Nagano Prefecture. He'd never wanted to be a soldier. He'd wanted to teach literature, to write poetry, to live a quiet life among the mountains. Instead, he'd been assigned to guard duty at Amori, tasked with overseeing men he'd been told were barbarians, monsters who bombed women and children. But when he looked at the prisoners, he saw only hunger and exhaustion, the same things he saw in the mirror. By February 1945, the guards' rations had been cut II. The Japanese military had prioritized frontline troops and kamikaze pilots. Guard units received whatever remained, which was almost nothing. Tanaka ate rice mixed with sawdust, supplemented by whatever he could scavenge from the bay seaweed shellfish, the occasional fish. He'd lost 30 pounds in 6 months. His uniform hung off his frame like a funeral shroud. The prisoners noticed. They saw the guards growing gaunt, saw the desperation in their eyes. Some prisoners felt satisfaction karma for the beatings, the humiliation, the deaths. But others, like Harrison, felt something more complicated. They saw men trapped in the same machine, ground down by the same inexorable logic of war. And that realization was more terrifying than hatred. Because if the enemy was human, then what did that make the war? The first crack in the wall came on January 15th. A prisoner named Lieutenant William Chun had collapsed during morning roll call. Malaria and malnutrition had reduced him to a skeleton. He lay on the frozen ground, convulsing, eyes rolled back. The camp commandant ordered the prisoners to leave him. If Chun couldn't stand, he would be left to die. Tanaka watched from his post. His orders were clear. Maintain discipline, enforce the commandant's rules, show no weakness. But something inside him broke. He moved forward, lifted Chun onto his shoulders, and carried him to the barracks. He did it in full view of the commandant, in defiance of direct orders. He expected to be beaten, perhaps executed. Instead, nothing happened. The commandant said nothing. The other guards looked away. And Tanaka understood. The rules had already collapsed. The machinery of discipline and punishment required resources, food, medical supplies, manpower. The camp had none. The guards were too exhausted to enforce the rules. The prisoners were too weak to resist. What remained was a fragile equilibrium held together by inertia and the faint hope that the war might end before everyone starved. But that hope was fading fast. In late January, a rumor spread through the camp. American forces had landed on Luzon in the Philippines. The Philippines had fallen in 1942, marking one of Japan's greatest victories. Now the Americans were coming back. The prisoners whispered about liberation, about going home. But they also whispered about something darker, the fear that the Japanese would execute all prisoners before surrendering. It had happened before. At Palawan in the Philippines, Japanese guards had herded 150 American POWs into air raid shelters, doused them with gasoline, and set them on fire. Only 11 escaped. The massacre had occurred just 2 months earlier. In December 1944, the prisoners at Amori knew the story. They saw the way the guards watched them, the way conversations stopped when prisoners approached. They felt the tension coiling tighter day by day, and then the rations stopped entirely. On February 1st, the kitchen received no rice, no fish, no vegetables. The supply convoy from the mainland had been sunk by American submarines. The camp's reserves were exhausted. The commandant announced that rations would be temporarily suspended until new supplies arrived. He did not say when that would be. He did not need to. Everyone knew the truth. They were going to starve. The first night without food, the barracks were silent. Men lay on their bunks, too weak to speak, too hungry to sleep. The cold seeped through the walls like a living thing, settling into bones and joints. Harrison lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of breathing slow, labored fading. He thought about his mother's kitchen in Nebraska, about Sunday dinners and fresh bread. The memories were torture. The second night, men began to crack. A British prisoner tried to steal food from another man's hidden stash. A fight broke out, weak and pathetic. 2 skeletons grappling in the dark. The guards didn't intervene. They were too hungry to care. And then, on the third night, Tanaka appeared. He came after midnight, moving like a ghost through the barracks. He carried a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Harrison heard him first, the soft shuffle of boots on wood, the rustle of fabric. He sat up, expecting a beating, a search, some new cruelty. Instead, Tanaka knelt beside his bunk and set the bag on the floor. Inside were 6 cans of sardines. Harrison stared. Tanaka said nothing. His face was unreadable in the darkness, but his hands were steady. He opened one can with a small knife, divided the contents into 2 portions using a piece of paper, and handed one to Harrison. And then he sat down on the floor and ate his share, slowly, methodically, as if it were a sacrament. Harrison didn't move. He couldn't process what was happening. This was the enemy. This was the man who had beaten prisoners during roll call, who had stood silent while others were tortured. And now he was sharing his food. Tanaka finished eating, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked at Harrison. He spoke in broken English, the words halting and careful. War over soon. We all hungry. You die, I die, no difference. Then he stood and moved to the next bunk, repeating the ritual. He shared a can with Lieutenant Shan, who wept as he ate. He shared another with an Australian pilot named Davies, who stared in disbelief. By the time Tanaka left the barracks, he had distributed all 6 cans. He had kept nothing for himself beyond the single half-portion he'd shared with Harrison. The prisoners didn't speak. They ate in silence, each man alone with his thoughts, trying to reconcile what had just happened with everything they believed about the war, the enemy, and themselves. Outside, the wind howled across Tokyo Bay. Somewhere in the distance, air raid sirens began to wail. American bombers were coming again, bringing fire and death to a city already reduced to ash. The war continued, indifferent to the small act of mercy, unfolding in a forgotten prison camp on a man-made island. But for the men in that barracks, everything had changed. Over the following weeks, Tanaka returned each night. He brought whatever he could scavenge fish he'd caught in the bay, seaweed boiled into a bitter broth, once a sack of rice he'd stolen from the officers' quarters at great personal risk. He never asked for gratitude or acknowledgment. He simply appeared, shared what he had, and left. The other guards noticed. Some looked away, complicit in their silence. Others began to follow Tanaka's example, slipping food to prisoners when the commandant wasn't watching. The camp's brutal hierarchy began to dissolve, replaced by a desperate camaraderie born of shared suffering. Guards and prisoners worked together to catch fish, to forage for edible plants, to keep each other alive, but not everyone approved. On February 18th, the commandant discovered Tanaka's actions. He was dragged from his post and beaten in front of the assembled prisoners and guards. The commandant accused him of treason, of betraying the emperor, of dishonoring the sacred duty of the Imperial Japanese Army. Tanaka did not defend himself. He knelt in the mud, blood streaming from his nose and mouth, and accepted the punishment in silence. The prisoners watched, helpless. Harrison felt something break inside him, not despair, but rage. Rage at the war, at the men who had started it, at the machinery that demanded Tanaka be punished for the crime of compassion. He wanted to intervene, to fight, to scream. But he was too weak. They all were. Tanaka was stripped of his rifle and reassigned to latrine duty, the lowest position in the camp. He was given half rations as punishment. The other guards were warned. Any further acts of insubordination would result in execution. But Tanaka continued. At night, when the camp was dark and the commandant was asleep, he still came to the barracks. He still shared his half rations, still brought whatever he could find. And the prisoners, understanding the risk he was taking, began to protect him. They covered for him during inspections, lied to the commandant, diverted suspicion. The bond between captor and captive had transformed into something else entirely, a conspiracy of survival, a rebellion against the war itself. And then, on March 9th, the sky caught fire. The firebombing of Tokyo that night killed over 100,000 people. American B-29s dropped incendiary bombs that turned the city into an inferno. The flames were visible from Amori, a wall of orange and red that stretched across the horizon. The prisoners watched from the barracks, torn between horror and grim satisfaction. This was the enemy's capital, burning. This was justice for Pearl Harbor, for Bataan, for the thousands who had died in captivity. But when they looked at Tanaka, standing at his post with tears streaming down his face, they felt no satisfaction, only sorrow. Tanaka's family lived in Tokyo. He didn't know if they had survived. He wouldn't know for weeks. But in that moment, watching his city burn, he understood what the prisoners had already learned. War does not discriminate. It devours everyone equally, soldiers and civilians, captors and captives, the guilty and the innocent. The prisoners said nothing. They simply stood beside him, sharing the vigil, united in grief. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. American forces arrived at Camp Amori on August 29th, led by the 11th Airborne Division. They found a camp on the brink of collapsed prisoners who weighed less than 90 pounds, guards who were barely in better condition. The liberation was swift and efficient. The prisoners were evacuated to hospitals. The guards were arrested and processed as POWs. Tanaka was among them. Harrison, recovering in a military hospital in Guam, learned of Tanaka's fate through Red Cross records. Tanaka had been transferred to a detention facility in Yokohama, awaiting trial for war crimes. The charges were routine complicity in prisoner abuse, failure to prevent deaths in custody. The penalty, if convicted, was execution. Harrison knew the charges were unjust. Tanaka had saved lives, not taken them. But he also knew that justice, in the aftermath of war, was a blunt instrument. It demanded accountability, and it rarely distinguished between the cruel and the kind. Harrison wrote letters, dozens of them, to military tribunals, to the Red Cross, to anyone who would listen. He detailed Tanaka's actions, the food he'd shared, the risks he'd taken. He was joined by Lieutenant Chun, by Davies, by every prisoner who had witnessed Tanaka's compassion. They testified, they pleaded, they demanded that the truth be heard. It took 9 months. In May 1946, the tribunal dismissed the charges against Tanaka Hiroshi. He was released and allowed to return home. The decision was unprecedented. Guards were almost never exonerated. But the testimony of the prisoners he had saved was overwhelming. The tribunal concluded that Tanaka had acted with extraordinary moral courage in defiance of orders, and that his actions had preserved life in circumstances where death was expected. Tanaka returned to Nagano. He never spoke publicly about the war. He became a teacher, as he had always wanted, and spent his life educating children in a small mountain village. He never married. He lived quietly, surrounded by books and memories. Harrison returned to Nebraska. He married, raised 3 children, and ran his family's farm. But he never forgot Tanaka. Every year, on February 3rd, he would sit alone in his kitchen and open a tin of sardines. He would eat half and leave half uneaten, a ritual of remembrance. In 1972, Harrison traveled to Japan. He found Tanaka in Nagano, teaching at the same school he had worked at for 26 years. The 2 men sat together in a small tea room overlooking the mountains. They spoke for hours, though neither had learned the other's language fluently. They spoke in gestures and shared silences, in the unspoken understanding of men who had survived the same hell. Before Harrison left, Tanaka gave him a gift, a book of poetry he had written during the war. The poems were in Japanese, but Harrison didn't need to understand the words. He understood the heart behind them. Tanaka died in 1984 at the age of 62. Harrison died in 1993 at 74. Neither man considered himself a hero. They had simply done what they believed was right in a world that demanded they do otherwise. The story of Jack Harrison and Tanaka Hiroshi was never widely known. It did not appear in history books or official records. It survived only in letters, buried testimonies, and the memories of the men who witnessed it, the prisoners who saw Tanaka share his last ration, the guards who chose to look away. They remembered because the story defied the logic of war. War demands absolutes, us and them, ally and enemy. It teaches hatred, dehumanization, and survival at any cost. But Harrison and Tanaka refused those rules. They saw each other not as enemies, but as men hungry, frightened, and desperate to live. In that recognition, they committed a quiet rebellion. The war taught them to kill. They chose to feed. The war taught them to hate. They chose to share. In the simple act of dividing a tin of sardines, they reclaimed the humanity war tried to erase. Camp Omori was demolished in 1946. Tokyo Bay was rebuilt. The place where they shared that final ration vanished beneath steel and concrete. But the memory endured, passed through families and veteran stories when official records failed. Perhaps that is war's truest legacy, not battles or victories, but small acts of compassion, when enemies become brothers. When hunger is shared, two men, one tin of sardines. A bond that defied empires and refuses to be forgotten.